Earlier, I failed to introduce my co-hosts here, and they're Jared Mannion up here, who's just sitting down, who's the co-chair with me of the Berkeley program in Church and World programs, and Walt Grazer, who worked with me at the Bishops' Conference and with the National Religious Partnership for the Environment for many years. And Walt is a consultant now with the Catholic Climate Covenant and an adjunct professor here at Georgetown. So you'll be meeting them later on with the other panels. As Sean said earlier, one of the more difficult and unlikely, I suppose, intersections in this area of environment is the intersection of security and environment. And for that reason, it was quite remarkable that the Defense Department identified climate change as a security threat for the US. And we'll hear from some of our panelists about why that is, I think. But I think we have very different kind of perspectives here. People who are very experienced with the security community in this country. Marianne Cusimano-Love, professor at Catholic University. She's a consultant to the Bishops' Conference on International Affairs. She's worked on various committees at the Council on Foreign Relations and has been a frequent consultant and educator for the Defense Department. Al Pierce is the head of the Institute for Ethics and Leadership at the National Defense University, previously founded a similar institute at the Naval Academy. For me, he was a great colleague and friend as the chairman of the board of America Magazine when I was editor-in-chief there. So it's with great delight that I want to welcome him back here. He's been teaching ethics here to freshmen for several years and continues to do so in the School of Management. And then we have Russ Burkhoff, who is a cybersecurity specialist, but had extraordinary experience in his early life in the way the military helped in an environmental cleanup. And so he's going to give us a kind of on-the-ground experience of how the military engages and what the additional added value is of that kind of work. So without further ado, let me introduce Al Pierce. I'm sorry, Marianne Cusimano-Love, sorry.
Thank you for inviting me to be part of this conversation on environment and security and really the evolution of environmental ethics. And as Drew said, a lot of attention came when the last Quadrennial Defense Review in 2014 identified environmental change and climate change as a security threat. It got a lot of headlines, but that was a long time in coming. So what I'm going to do is just set the stage a little bit for how these norms have changed within the US military. Norms don't drop from the sky. They develop over time. They often develop after practice. And so I'm going to be talking a bit about how norms change, how norms develop, how this has happened in the Department of Defense to move from what I call dirty defense, kind of the scorched earth, or there's a lot of environmental damage done by war and defense, to now a more proactive idea about integrating climate change and environmental issues into the overall way of looking at the job of the Department of Defense. I also find that there is a real parallel between how the Defense Department has expanded its conception of environmental ethics and expanded its conception of environmental policy and that of the Catholic Church. And we'll talk about, maybe have some time for that in the Q&A. But when reading Laudato Si, many of the passages I thought I was reading the Quadrennial Defense Review. So it's very interesting, some of the overlap. I think that's true because, and this is kind of my bottom line up front before I trace out a little bit of the history, both the military and the church are conservative institutions. These are not the ones who are going to be innovators and developing, generating new norms. And they were not the early adapters to environmental ethics. As Catherine Marshall pointed out, other groups were there first. But because of several institutional facets of these organizations, these are some of the largest landowners on earth. And unlike some of the other big landowners on Earth, where their land is very geographically centralized in one country, like the Arab princes and monarchs, for example, both the lands of the Catholic Church and of the U.S. military are very geographically dispersed. That means they've gained practical experience around the world on the front lines of climate change, on the front lines of the impact of environmental issues on security issues. They gain a lot of experience also in their own responsibility for responsible stewardship of these vast properties. So they learn by doing, and the environmental ethic evolved first by a basic stewardship ethic to take care of their own properties and, in some cases, clean up their own mess, clean up the toxic mess from the Cold War and previous wars, to now a more proactive integration of environmental issues. And because, again, of the unique characteristics of both these institutions, the Pentagon has universities, it has schools, it runs a huge healthcare network. They hire many non-nationals, they operate around the world, and they do a lot of foreign military education and training. They have great opportunities for norm propagation, again, similar to the Catholic Church. So neither of them are going to be the early adopters developing new norms, but both of them can help these new norms reach a tipping point of wider acceptance to the wider world. So we've seen, again, the ideas of environmental security in the Pentagon move from the direct effects of military operations and warfare to ideas of more environmental stewardship and to the environmental dimensions of security problems. Now, probably the biggest push in this direction was the National Environmental Protection Act of 1970. That required all U.S. government entities to integrate environmental concerns into decision making. Unlike most of the other landmark legislation, environmental legislation of the 1970s, the Clean Air, Clean Water Act, et cetera, this was not a content law. This was not aiming at a particular outcome, clean air, clean water. This was a process law, a transparency and accountability process law that said the U.S. government should do no harm and must integrate environmental factors into decision making. So the military understands the U.S. Constitution very well, and Article 1 particularly, and they saluted Congress and immediately set up their environmental command under the Joint Chiefs of Staff. That later was expanded in the 90s to the creation of the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Environmental Security, and it moved from just a stewardship and cleanup of military bases, kind of the first generation of environmental issues, to integrating environmental concerns into the national security strategy. So what grabbed headlines in 2014 with the Quadrennial Defense Review was actually first in doctrine and policy in the 90s in terms of making its way beyond just mere stewardship, reactive cleanup, to integrating those concerns into the way we look at security issues. We saw it in the 2010 Quadrennial Defense Review. We saw it in the 2014 Quadrennial Defense Review. Many, many places, and this is, you can read through those documents in which they came to a more expansive view. Now, in looking at how that trajectory occurred, in environmental issues, we often talk about the inverted U hypothesis, that countries, as they develop economically, they start out with a phase of dirty development. Then when they reach a level of economic development, they start to clean up their act and become attentive to environmental policy. I propose that we see a similar arc with the Defense Department's attention to environmental issues, that you had a period of dirty defense, and then you reached a tipping point. And that tipping point was imposed by Congress in the environmental legislation that forced all the federal government to pay attention to these issues. And then they moved to clean up their act. So what do I mean? Well, we always know that war causes environmental degradation, the scorched earth policy. Sometimes that can literally be a scorched earth, like in the atomic bombings in the Second World War, in the nuclear testing, and the damage done in New Mexico, Nevada, the Bikini Islands, Marshall Islands, et cetera. And sometimes it can be other more ordinary ways in which defense operations pollute the environment, just dumping fuel, lots and lots of military bases became Superfund sites because they were dumping airline fuel or the fuel from the Jeeps, et cetera, right into the soil. So there's lots of ways in which we can see this dirty defense in which the environment is harmed by defense operations, okay? And as I said, the first generation required the military to clean up the toxic legacy of the Cold War and to integrate environmental decision-making into defense processes. And that was the first generation under that NEPA law. The second generation, though, has been this growing realization from the mid-90s to the present that not only does war create environmental degradation, but environmental degradation leads to conflict and war. And that certainly in the 1990s was a scholarly argument put forward by Thomas Homer Dixon, Michael Clare, and many others. But we've seen many places from Rwanda to Syria where the environmental degradation has been a force multiplier, has been something that has been a tipping point to lead to greater environmental issues, can be a tipping point to exacerbate the conflict fissures in society. So this has moved the Pentagon to be moving away from a reactive approach of environmental cleanup to a more proactive approach to seeing how along the line do we need to be attending to environmental degradation because it is an indicator of conflict and can lead to greater responsibilities for the Department of Defense. So these things are happening simultaneously. It's not either or. The military is still cleaning up these huge number of Superfund sites at military bases. They're also seeing the environmental impacts and the climate change impacts at military bases, while also being called to respond to increased flooding, increased humanitarian disasters, and to regional conflicts that have dimensions of those conflicts that were environmentally caused. So we see a movement from environmental stewardship to environmental protection to now one of more risk mitigation. And again, in that area, I also see a parallel between the process of the Catholic Church and the process of the US military to move beyond stewardship to an ethics of risk, that the most vulnerable should be protected. And we see some of the very same language of protection in the military's documents about environmental risk and in the Vatican's documents of environmental risk. So there you have it, over 50 years of doctrinal and institutional development on environment and security in under 7 minutes, but obviously a lot to talk about with the rest of our actors and in the Q&A. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mary Ann. Al?
Thank you very much, Drew. Drew remarked on my involvement with him at American Magazine. What he didn't tell you was he asked me to join the board, and I didn't realize until the first meeting, and I don't know whether he leveraged it this way, but as punishment for my sins, they elected me board chair. So I ended up doing more than I had bargained for initially, but that was one of the most satisfying things I've ever done in my life, is to work with Drew and to bring America more into the 21st century. But we can talk about that separately later if you all want to. Mary Ann's right, the challenge is 5 to 7 minutes, and that's awfully hard to do. I will note for the record that the professor from the civilian university used PowerPoint. The professor from the Defense Department university will not use PowerPoint. It's easy to do with this audience. When I do it in my day job, people often have withdrawal symptoms, and we have to put them through a 12-step program in order to adjust to life without PowerPoint. I believe firmly with my former student and friend Jim Mattis that PowerPoint makes us stupid, but except for Mary Ann. I'm required to give you a disclaimer. What you are about to hear are my own views, and they are not necessarily those of the National Defense University, the Department of Defense, the U.S. government, or any institution or individual on the face of the earth. Okay, now I'm clean with my general counsel now. It builds nicely. What I'm going to try to do builds nicely on what Mary Ann did. And I'll actually take my cue from something Michael Kessler said at the very beginning. about how policymakers with different perspectives and different responsibilities have to interact in this business. Policy is made by people, and in the US government, mainly by senior leaders in large, complex, traditional, powerful organizations. So I want to talk, I've spent the last 35 years of my life, plus years of my life, as a Defense Department employee, most of that in an academic setting, but I still work for the US Department of Defense. And I thought it would be useful to reflect on two things: what it is about large organizations and senior leaders that might make it difficult for them to, in this case, take into account environmental concerns. And then second, identify some factors that actually help move them in the direction of coming to grips with environmental concerns. So first, why is this difficult? Why was it difficult for the US Defense Department? I mean, first of all, large, traditional, successful organizations often have difficulty adapting to new realities, new opportunities, and new challenges. Case in point, IBM, how long it took them to realize people wanted personal computers. Okay? IBM was a large, powerful, traditional, successful organization, but it was very difficult for them to adapt to new realities. Second point I would make here is the challenge for senior leaders. I think it's hard to imagine, and I've worked for 3 directors of the Arms Control Agency, 2 secretaries of defense. It's hard for people to imagine the daily demands on them. So if today you were the Secretary of Defense or the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, your day would be taken up by North Korea, China, sea lanes, Russia, Ukraine, India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Israeli-Palestinian, Egypt, Libya, al-Shabaab, Somalia, migrations, Turkey, the Baltics, defenses in Europe, Brexit, nuclear proliferation, terrorism, budgets, force structure, and modernization, just to name a few. And so the challenge for senior leaders is the competition is intense to get any of their time and attention. And the struggle for the rest of the organization is to try to get something onto the desk of the person at the top. The people at the top are driven by what I call the tyranny of the inbox. It's a chronic challenge in large, complex organizations to pay attention to the long term when your day is filled with the short term and the immediate. One of the chronic laments of senior executives, certainly in the Defense Department, but I don't think it's unique there, is the challenge of finding time to think, to step back from the urgent and to reflect on the broader, the deeper, the longer term things. And George Marshall in World War II, when he was Chief of Staff of the Army, used to leave the Pentagon every day at 5 o'clock. And he would go to his quarters in Fort Myers and go horseback riding alone. That was his way to find time to think. It's almost inconceivable that any senior official would leave the Pentagon at 5 o'clock in 2016. And I always remind my colleagues that actually World War II was a pretty big war, and we did pretty well at the end of it. And somehow George Marshall managed to leave the Pentagon every day at 5 o'clock. So I think the nature of large, complex organizations and the demands on the time of senior officials help us understand why the Defense Department may have been slower than other organizations in adapting to environmental realities. What are some factors that help us along the way? And I'll identify 5 in no particular order here. One, Mary Ann already touched on, congressional reporting requirements and legislation. The Defense Department firmly believes in Article 1 and Article 3, as well as Article 2 of the Constitution, even though we're part of the executive branch. The reporting requirements that the Congress imposes on the Defense Department are enormous. In 2015, DoD submitted 15 reports to Congress just on military health issues, only on that one narrow band of issues. But the Defense Department does respond, and in July of 2015, in response to congressional mandate, DoD issued the National Security Implications of Climate-Related Risks in a Changing Climate. And that was sort of a later development in the long string of events that Mary Ann cited. But responding to congressional requirements is an important function, and Congress required DoD in that last report, each U.S. Geographic Combatant Command had to report on the integration of climate-related risks management, Mary Ann just talked about risks management, into their planning processes, and discuss resources and timeline for coming to grips with all of that. I think a second factor that moves DoD along the line more quickly in this is, quite frankly, budget constraints. I know it's hard for people who don't work for the Defense Department to think of the Defense Department as having budget constraints, but actually we do. And part of that budget constraint is the drive for energy efficiency, because fuel costs are astronomical. And so if that one factor drives some of DoD's thinking about being more energy efficient. Third, and Marianne touched on this too with her site about the Superfund sites, the harm to base populations. And here this taps into not environmental ethics, but a part of professional military ethics, which is take care of your people. And so when the military members and their families are impacted where they live by environmental degradation caused by DoD, this taps into something that's an important part of the military ethos. You have to take care of your people. You have to clean it up and then try to reduce the likelihood that things like that are going to happen again. I think a fourth factor, and maybe in some ways the most important, is a growing awareness among military planners that environmental crises can trigger interventions and even armed conflict. It can call for relief humanitarian assistance or open armed conflict. And there have been a series of Defense Department reports, particularly over the last decade. There was a Defense Science Board task force in 2011. Of all places, the Marine Corps Warfighting Lab issued a report in 2015 on the connection between environment and security. And in just July of this year, the Defense Department issued a document called the Joint Operating Environment, which really underscores the problems of human interaction with environmental crises. A fifth factor I would cite was something also that Sean Casey touched on again, and that's the cross-fertilization between institutions and organizations and people outside the government and those of us inside. So if you think back over the past 10 years or so, the Atlantic Council, Carnegie Mellon, the American Security Project, Security Studies Institute at the Army War College, the Triangle Institute for Security Studies, International Peace Academy. There have been any number of outside think tanks and organizations that have produced reports on the relationship between environment and security, and these get fed into, at one level or another, in the department's thinking about these things. To wrap up, I just want to say, first of all, and somebody touched on this earlier, the Defense Department is not an environmental organization. It's not a non-governmental organization. It's not an activist group. But I think if you try to understand the Defense Department and the environment, it's critical to realize that it is eminently a pragmatic, practical institution. And it will come to grips with legislative mandates. It will come to grips with changes in the environment in the real world that affect its core mission, which is to provide the military forces needed to deter war and to protect the security of the country. And I think what we're seeing is a broadening of the notion of the security of the country and what needs to be done to protect the security of the country. Thank you.
Thank you, Al. Russ is now going to give us an on-ground description of his involvement in an effort not to protect the personnel of the U.S. military, but rather protect the citizens of other countries from the products of war. So, Russ?
So good morning, and it's a real privilege for me to be here. In the spirit of our own panelist diversity, I'm going to stand up and present and not have slides. So you can enjoy.
We've had all combinations.
You get it all. Yeah, not to confuse you. Father Drew gave me quite a homework assignment, and I wanted to align my experiences that I had in the earlier part of my life in the mid-'90s to something that aligned with kind of what we're talking about today. So my comments obviously are to address some of the top issues of the intersection between the environment and security. I'd like to posit as an example and possible model to influence future international moral and ethical challenges the example of humanitarian demining and the Mine Ban Treaty, or the Ottawa Treaty of 1997. I'd like to offer some insights as to a path to actuate this challenge into the security character of a state and its freedom of action in warfare, and in this case, to eradicate anti-personnel mines. The global initiative for the Mine Ban Treaty began with the United Nations, 6 NGOs, and the persistence of a future Nobel Peace Prize winner, Jody Williams. I believe this group became the advocate and the voice for civil society to push this treaty and to make this treaty into fruition. What I'd like to ask first, though, are there demonstrable inflection points that can reorient society to a more realistic state? A reality that offers balance between the environment, power, and technology, and that impacts human development. Is it possible to be more anticipatory of these inflection points on the international stage, where international moral norms can be effectively promoted in the international system? Is there a legitimate path for civil society to be heard in this system? And with regard to security, can the voice of civil society influence the security functions of a state and its freedom of action in warfare? So I wanted to just kind of build a little bit of a broad framework, and then I'm going to take you back. I'm going to pull a little different thread to give you a little different dimension on my experience. In 1994, I was a senior commander in Okinawa, Japan, for Army Special Forces, or Army Green Berets. I was tasked by the commander of the Pacific Theater to organize a team to deploy to Cambodia and survey and establish the first humanitarian demining program. Congress at that time had earmarked $1.2 million. At the time, Cambodia had between 8 and 10 million mines and UXOs, or unexploded ordnance, in the ground. They had the highest number of amputees in the world, about 40,000, and the largest prosthetics factory in the world. Most of the amputees were from the most poverty-stricken peoples in the remote areas, which further accentuated their poverty times 3. The mines were a result of over 30 years of civil war and strife and numerous armies and factions indiscriminately installing the anti-personnel mines, and in the eastern part of the country, unexploded ordnances were left from U.S. bombing during Vietnam War. All this had created an enormous burden on the civilian population. Our goal when we arrived was to help reform the Royal Cambodian Armed Forces, and then to train their regional engineers to clear the mines using indigenous equipment. And then we also brought a piece of technology, the Austrian Schiebel mine detector, and to further develop them into more self-sufficient train-the-trainer type of program so they can continue this into the future. To ultimately have them clear their own land, to build out the infrastructure, and then to obviously grow their economy and be a participant in the transformation that was going on in Asia. The Royal Cambodian Armed Forces was highly corrupt at the time, and it was questionable whether they could wrap their head around and support or be an impediment for the demining program. We had an active insurgency going on with the Khmer Rouge. We had a newly installed tri-government at the time, and the reconstitution of the royal family. So at this time, I sat back and I said, you know, as a strategic asset for the U.S. military, I really wanted to understand what got us to here and what happened to Cambodia. I wanted to take a look at the Pacific Commander's strategy for the area and how we fit into that. At the time, the U.S. wanted to demonstrate long-term commitment in Asia and remain an Asia-Pacific power. We called this cooperative engagement, and part of that, we conducted reassurance, providing a sense of natural security, provide a sense of U.S. continuity and stability to promote democracy in the area. We wanted to be engaging with China for obvious reasons, but we also wanted to cooperate with our other Asian partners for security and confidence building to counter the growth of China. We also wanted to show transparency of our capabilities and intentions. And at the time, we conducted peacekeeping operations and humanitarian relief missions, approximately 325 bilateral exchange and training programs, and 77 humanitarian civic programs in 23 countries. One interesting comment made by the commander, the theater commander of the Pacific, in his closing remarks of his strategy was that the U.S. cannot long sustain its commitment to Asia without public support and then thus close consultation with Congress. So I looked at this and I wanted to see what was going on in the international arena, which was, to me, what set into place more of the answers to what I asked in the original questions up front. At this time in Cambodia, in 92 and 93, one of the most notable peacekeeping efforts was by the United Nations Transactional Authority in Cambodia, called UNTAC, which oversaw refugee repatriation and civil administration reform, demobilizations of militias, the organization and conduct of elections, and other matters to bring relief to the long-suffering people of Cambodia. Key in all this that UNTAC stood up was the CMAC, or the Cambodian Mine Action Center. And in 1992, it was there designed to assist the safe return of thousands of refugees across the country. Reorganizing that large number of landmines and UXOs across Cambodia was a significant threat to post-conflict reconstruction and continuing development. In 1991, 6 NGOs supporting a ban of landmines began organizing the international campaign to ban landmines, or the ICBL. The coalition was formed in 92 by the 6 groups, and the campaign was since grown and spread to become a network with active members in some 100 countries, including groups working on women, children, veterans, religious groups, the environment, human rights, arms control, peace and development, working locally, nationally, and internationally to eradicate anti-personnel mines, along with a prominent supporter of Diana, Princess of Wales. In 1993, the first international NGO conference on landmines was held in London, organized by the ICBL. At the time, the US State Department published a report, Hidden Killer, the Global Problem with Uncleared Landmines. The ICBL also issued the study, Landmines, A Deadly Legacy. In 1995, the first national law to ban anti-personnel mines was passed in Belgium. And in 96, Canada launches the Ottawa process to ban landmines by hosting a meeting among like-minded anti-landmine states. In 1997, the Ottawa Treaty is adopted, open for signature, and signed by 122 states. And Jody Williams, the leader of the ICBL, is awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. Today, international investment continues in landmines throughout the globe to the tune of $5.6 billion into approximately 28 countries. It continues in Cambodia to the tune of about $30 million a year. CMAC has become an autonomous national organization, and the use of some of the most advanced mine clearing technology has been developed to clear still an estimated 4 million mines in Cambodia. So I ask, off my initial questions, what are these inflection points that we have in our global society? What are the legitimate paths for civil society to have a voice that can reach some level of actualization and possibly influence the security functions of states and their perceived freedom of action in warfare? Thank you.
So I'm going to begin by asking Russ to answer his own question. What are some of these inflection points, and what do the other presenters think of these inflection points for change in civic and political involvement in environmental problems?
So fair enough. So I think it is an inflection point where there's something, some phenomena occurred where the non-government organizations and the collaboration with the United Nations was seeing the results of this indiscriminate use of landmines, anti-personnel mines, actually. And so there was some kind of bubbling, there was some kind of activity that caused this to, reach I think a humanitarian point, but also an intersection with the rest of, I'd maybe say the modern society's security, where they realized that in order to help facilitate let's say the U.S. for our own personal stabilization activities to promote democracy, it's really hard to do that if there's not an effort to help the people that are there on the ground. And these folks, if they don't get this help, things start to turn. Things start to turn where they realize they don't have hope, and then they start turning to where they lose control and kind of a role where it goes into a state of chaos. So this kind of effort to me is an example of an inflection point where the humanitarian demining was able to bubble up and reach the level of being able to develop into a treaty, get the recognition not only at the UN but with the Nobel Peace Prize, and then have the policies of many countries change their approach to their stockpiles of landmines, their production of landmines, and their shipment of landmines to other countries.
Marianne, what kind of inflection points do you see?
Well, in the story I told about how DoD has been moving to integrate environmental issues more into the way they look at security, I think what you see in that particular narrative is kind of a perfect storm developing that led to a tipping point. There was pressures from within the Department of Defense to clean up these own bases because their own people were suffering. There was pressures within the United States, democracy, self-government, and we changed our ideas as a people for what we thought acceptable levels of environmental degradation were, and passed a flurry of legislation in the 1970s that were just a sea change. The National Environmental Protection Act that I said is the Magna Carta of those laws. So the institution had to respond to these pressures within the United States to address environmental issues. But then they were also facing pressures externally. Very practical pressures, the erosion of their assets, because they were seeing higher impact storms and higher impact weather events eroding their military bases. They were seeing increased operational tempo of having to respond to humanitarian interventions from the 1990s onwards. They were seeing these huge population movements that we're all seeing, our largest number of refugees since the Second World War, and the ways in which that can facilitate or exacerbate existing conflict lines. So when they're seeing them internally, there's internal pressure, there's external pressure, there's an opportunity to move very slow-moving institutions. And so I think that's part of the story. Now, are all issues subject to that? Some issues have a better chance to put a human face on it, have a better chance to mobilize civil society and get both legislative as well as voluntary responses. So not all issues are equally positioned to be able to get that kind of reception. Climate change for a long time has suffered because it was harder in the early years to put a human face on climate change. It seemed remote and technical. Unfortunately, as climate change has been exacerbated in recent years, it's much easier to put a human face on these issues. And that human face is coming closer and closer, even to Abilene, Texas, to reference John Casey. So we may be reaching that tipping point on this issue area where we were able to reach it earlier on the tipping point of landmines.
Al, you teach, you want to address this first?
Yeah, if I may, I'm not sure that, I think, first of all, I think Marianne was right to underscore NEPA in 1970. Earth Day, NEPA, that was a catalytic event in the United States, and it had global implications. But if the question is in DoD, I guess I'm not sure, DoD and the environment, I'm not sure I see inflection points. I think it was a gradual awareness along the way. No analogy is perfect, so here I go demonstrating that. Sometimes, some people wake up like this first thing in the morning. The inflection point is when the alarm goes off. I think most people wake up very slowly, and you sort of start to regain consciousness, and then you lose it, and then you go back. I think it was a gradual process in the Defense Department rather than particular inflection points.
Okay, what I wanted to follow up on was, this is the description we've gotten now of these large organizations. It's a gradual, incremental process. But then you have a process of veteran policymakers, defense secretaries, secretaries of state, suddenly getting religion when they're out of office and maybe reached an age. You can understand it, they're not under the pressures of the political pressures of holding office. And old age frequently gives people insight into the broader world that they didn't have when they were occupying a position in society that defined roles. But I always find in ethics that it's important to teach people the importance of imagination, that when you face ethical problems, most of our problems are that we can't rethink the issue to be able to solve it. Since you teach ethics to military people and other senior executives, do you have some examples of where there have been breakthroughs because some leaders have had a special gift for imagination, moral imagination, and therefore took on something that you wouldn't expect them to?
I mean, I think you're onto something, and part of it, I think, is the difference between individuals and institutions. Large, complex, powerful organizations move slowly. In the 1970s, I was working in a think tank in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and one of the senior people there used a line that stuck with me. And he said, elephantine bureaucracies perform elephantine tasks. They can't leap like gazelles. And so they move slowly, and they do what they do. Sometimes the elephants run a little faster than other times, but basically you're not going to look for agility and speed from an elephant. But if you think about the role of individuals in large, complex organizations, I think that one example I would give, it's not exactly germane to our subject, but I think there was a burst of imagination in the late 1940s in the US government about something had to be done to rebuild a world that had been destroyed. It was not inevitable that we had a Marshall Plan. I think it was the ability to imagine a different future than a straight line trajectory of just sort of leaving the destruction bare. More recently, well, I guess also at the same time, there was another burst of imagination and hard thinking that said, now that we know that atomic nuclear weapons exist, how do we prevent their use? Bernard Brody, who had taught strategy for many, many years, including at the Naval War College, said, up until now, in the aftermath of reading a newspaper account of Hiroshima, said, up until now, the purpose of military establishments has been to fight and win wars. Now their principal purpose is to prevent them. And so a lot of creative thinking took place inside the military, but outside, to try to solve this new problem. How do we prevent the use of these things? And it is remarkable that none have been used since August 9th, 1945. So I think it was imagination and hard thinking that created a structure of deterrence. So those are two examples I can think of where either an individual or clusters of individuals use some imagination to solve an unprecedented problem, or a problem, at least in the case of destruction of World War II, destruction on a problem on an unprecedented scale. And imagine and then implement, not just imagine, but implement a very different world than otherwise might have happened.
Marianne.
So this is a point of contention among people in my field who study how do new norms develop and how do they propagate. And the usual story is kind of what Al just outlined, that individuals matter, kind of the great man, and I do emphasize man in history, is the story that's often told. So you hear a narrative about the importance of moral entrepreneurs as being those innovators in the lab who are coming up with new ideas, and then this straight linear process from that to the new norm. And the gender divide there has changed when you tell the story of landmines in terms of it was Jody Williams had this idea working from a personal computer in her kitchen, and we changed the landmines treaty. Now, that is certainly true. There are individuals who go into the lab, who come up with ideas, who are moral entrepreneurs. But the less sexy side of the equation is it's not all about individuals. There are these large organizations, there are these large institutions. And how do you get large institutions to either listen to these outliers, these new ideas, to then integrate them, and then to implement them in the vast array of activities? Now, that's a slower story to tell. It's a more complicated story to tell. but I think it's imperative, because otherwise you just have the generation of these new norms that may just fizzle out, that may not reach that tipping point to reach larger levels of society. So I tend to go towards the both and explanations, that we need both those innovators, and I also look at the role of religious actors in this innovation. Some religious, we heard Sean Casey talk about engagement with the religious community. There is no religious community, okay? There are, by some estimates, 80% of the people on the planet hold religious or spiritual beliefs, but that's a very, very diverse, both among different congregations and sects and within them. So how do you engage those very diverse groups of actors? And the same with the U.S. military. Anybody who's worked in science knows this is not a monolithic beast by any sense of the imagination. And it's not at all surprising that the Marine Corps has been on the leading edge of some of these issues of climate change, because they're Marine expeditionary forces that are tasked with looking at the border between land and sea, where you see the most impacts of climate change. So of course, within the military, there are going to be those who are early adopters and those who are later behind. And within the religious communities, the Quakers, the Mennonites, there are many groups that are often early adopters of new norms, whether it's anti-slavery, civil rights, et cetera. The Catholic Church has traditionally been a slow one to adopt a whole host of norms, whether it's international religious freedom, whether it's civil rights, and in this case, whether it's environmental stewardship and climate change. Now, it wasn't as slow as Laudato Si. John Paul II had a number of statements and encyclicals about environmental stewardship, et cetera, but it's slow. But when the Catholic Church engages, or when the U.S. military engages, they're not the early adopters, but they're these huge institutions with very large geographic impact, and they can play that tipping point role that helps to get greater propagation of that norm to wider circles. So I think we all have different roles to play. And it's not that we all have to be doing the exact same thing. We each have our own value added if you think of the whole supply chain of creating new norms, developing them, getting them accepted, and implementing them. And I think the church and the military may be later in that, but no less needed.
Thank you all. I think now we can turn to the audience and take questions. Yes, Walt.
Walt Grazer. So thank you very much. That was a really rich discussion, and it really is very complex. Just wondering, military people are at least used to some of the principles from just war and so forth. Can you apply any of this to environmental questions? Like climate change, does it rise to the occasion of a just purpose, in terms of a just cause and so forth? Who would be the proper authority? So I'm just wondering, in terms of trying to deal with norms, can you use some norms that are out there or not? It's a question on my mind.
My own view is yes. The way in which just war tradition has provided the greatest impact is less on decisions to enter conflict and more on constraining how conflicts are fought. And in that, there's a restriction on certainly not targeting civilians, but also making sure you're not doing more harm than good, and making sure you're leading to the circumstances that can cause a more just and sustainable peace. All of those aspects of the in bello components of just war tradition apply to environmental issues as well. Okay, if you're poisoning a water supply, you're killing civilians. If you're engaged in methods that are killing the land for generations, you are killing civilians and you're undermining the prospects for a sustainable peace. You're doing more harm than good. So I think what the environmental laws required the U.S. military to do was to think through the environmental impacts not only of cleaning up military bases, but at all aspects of military acquisition, weapons use, et cetera, so they wouldn't continue to be creating new Superfund sites here and abroad with the way we use force. And that, I think, really stems from that first do no harm component of the in bello restrictions. So I do think there's a foothold within just war theory that can be applicable to environmental concerns and security.
Al?
Not so much, I think because most of the attention is on the people and not on the planet.
I'm glad you raised it. I think it's good to take an existing body of ethical guidelines or principles, whatever we want, criteria, and apply them to a slightly different area. As you asked your question, I thought 20 years ago I wrote a piece taking just war and applying it to the use of economic sanctions. And so I think that's actually, I'm not taking credit for this, but it's an example of imagination, that you take an existing body of principles and try to apply them to a new problem. As if you think about just war in terms of the environment, I have to go back to Sean Casey's Flint example, which violates discrimination and proportionality, right? I mean, if the water system in a municipality goes wrong, there's no discrimination there. Everybody's drinking that water, and the harm, greatly outweighs any imaginable good that you could have by tolerating, poor water systems. But I think it's an opportunity for the kind of imagination Drew cited to take some existing principles and say, okay, how can we modify, adapt, apply them to a different area?
Russ, you want to say something?
Yeah, when Sean said, he was, talking about the Flint example, and we go into our house, and it doesn't matter, what demographic you are. Sorry about my voice. And you turn on the spigot, and the thing that came right to my mind was not water coming out, but trust. And that's, to me, the thread that we try to constantly do when we conduct our military operations, and we show that level of humanity and not trying to further destroy or damage what's going on. We're there for a purpose to build and to show, provide some kind of direction at the same time, but not to be humble about it and be able to try to shape that environment. That's more than just, to me, our conduct, but it's setting an example for a form of conduct that we expect them. We want to set an example with that, and being able to show the example of not infringing on human rights. A lot of times we get deployed into a country and, we're there because doing a military mission only because that's the only way the country would allow us to come in, is that we can come in and help train their military. But we always have other subcategories of areas to work on, and a lot of them, one of them is, helping them help teach humanitarian, humanitarian rights or human rights, and how they treat people, and to have those kinds of discussions. So this gets back into me. I like the form of applying a different framework for the just war to other frameworks for the environment. And I think that it allows us to be able to kind of move into a direction that's part of being able to build and to educate.
I just add that I think the just war here can serve as a model of how various principles are kind of organized into a quasi-system that can be applied in certain kinds of situation, more than it does provide specific principles, although, especially as Marianne has pointed out, there are principles that are very applicable. It seems to me that what you're looking for is the history of dealing with environmental problems leading to a set of principles that can be used when new problems come up. John Borelli?
Thank you. John Borelli, Georgetown University. Marianne, in your presentation, you talked about moving from a reactive model and a stewardship model to an ethics of risk. What would be some of the principles underlying an ethics of risk that would appeal both to religious and secular institutions?
So the job of the U.S. military is protection. Protection of the most vulnerable. And that is certainly the ethic of the Catholic Church, is protection of human life and human dignity with an option for the poor, putting the protection of the most vulnerable first. Now, historically, the U.S. military has interpreted that to mean the U.S. homeland, U.S. territory, U.S. military bases, Then that was widened after the Second World War. We never had standing alliances, permanent alliances in peacetime until after the Second World War. So you had a widening to other people who were kind of considered in that basket of protection. And now you're having, I think, an expansion again to realize even if we don't have a formal alliance relationship, there is either in the responsibility to protect that's emerging from the United Nations or in very practical considerations that the military faces. They are asked to intervene because they have this capacity in a variety of humanitarian interventions or a variety of situations, that they are asked to bring this capacity to bear, even in places that we don't have formal treaty alliances. But we're expanding those formal bilateral relations. We're now sending troops. We have U.S. troops in Australia, 2,500 of them now. Sometimes it surges up to 20,000, concerned about climate change refugees coming through the Pacific and the instability that can lead to fragile governments in the area, and the need for the U.S. military to be able to pre-position and pivot toward Asia. So I say that because there's been a widening out of who is in the circle of protection for the U.S. military. For the Catholic Church and religious organizations, they have a different idea. They're all in the circle of protection. We're all created in the image and likeness of God. Therefore, religious actors see a need to protect all vulnerable people, regardless of national origins. The demographic spread of religion, I think, is another thing to keep in mind here. Christianity is the only of the major world religions that really left the cradle of its origins. So Hinduism, still 99% in Asia, is culture, place of its origins. Islam, still 66%, 2/3, depending on whose polling numbers you're using, in Asia, in the countries of its origin. The only of the major, and Judaism is only in 2 countries, the US and Israel. Almost all Jews live in just those 2 countries. So when you look at the demographics and the geographic dispersion of religion, you see that Christianity and the Catholic Church is the largest representative within that, as the only of these major world religions that are forward-based. So that's like the same way we think about it in the military, that are pre-positioned in all these parts of the world. So that allows them to be able to see, it diminishes the distance between other and self, okay? In a way that allows you to see that other as within your moral responsibility of a circle of protection. So the U.S. military is widening its expansion of the circle of protection based on geopolitical realities and political decisions. The religious organizations are doing that as well, but because of their demographics, some may be better positioned to be able to make that leap than others.
Risk is a really important concept, and I'm glad you raised it. And it's useful to realize that certain things are inherently risky. Leading soldiers in a combat zone is inherently risky. Flying high-performance aircraft is inherently risky. Driving on the Capitol Beltway is inherently risky. So there's 2 ways to think about risk. One is to systematize it, and various places have it. But the other, it's more of an art to make the risk reasonable. And that gets us into prudence, which is a classic virtue here. In some cases, I think it is wise to try to reduce risk to 0. Drug use aboard nuclear-powered submarines. 0 tolerance is a good idea, right? But you can't reduce risk to 0 in leading soldiers in combat or flying high-performance aircraft or driving on the Beltway. So we have to think creatively about how we prudentially can minimize risk, yet still be able to accomplish what we're trying to do. I'm trying to get to Bethesda on the Beltway, or he's trying to lead his soldiers to do their mission in Cambodia. So managing risk is, I think, in many ways, despite efforts to systematize it, it's much more art than science. Inherently risky in the outbreak of infectious disease, public health professionals. That's an inherently risky occupation. If they wanted to reduce the risk to 0, they'd all stay home and not go to the site of the outbreak. But yet there are a whole series of prudential steps they take to minimize the risk to themselves and to minimize the risk of infection spreading to other people there. This is a very complex, important business. In some very few zones, I think it is reasonable to aim to try to reduce risk to zero. Elsewhere, I don't think it's possible to reduce risk to zero without admitting failure to accomplish what you're trying to do.
Back there, yes.
Hi, Anna Unruh Cohen with Senator Ed Markey. And in 2007, the CNA Military Board of Advisors put out a really seminal report on climate change and security issues, and then have continued to be engaged, which was and continues to be influential on Capitol Hill. And I just wondered if the panel had perspectives on how that may then be influencing what the current and active military thinkers and leaders are doing on climate and energy issues.
Yeah, I wouldn't want to comment. I mean, I did cite that one specifically in my remarks, but I wouldn't want to address the impact that the CNA report had. But I think, generally speaking, Sean Casey captured it well, that there's this cross-fertilization of ideas in Washington. And we're overflowing with think tanks, we're overflowing with government agencies, right? But individuals at a variety of levels interact from those domains. CNA, for example, has a lot of senior staff members and not so senior staff members who used to work in the Defense Department. So they have connections there. And I think it's a matter of that cross-fertilization, and then the challenge becomes, how do you get an idea to percolate its way up so that it reaches the top? That, as I said earlier, the competition for the time and the attention of senior officials is fierce and unrelenting, and it goes on every day. So that's the challenge. First of all, first part of the challenge is to get the ideas into the system. And then the second part is to create, is to get those ideas to the attention of the senior people. Well, in the church example, I mean, there are plenty of ideas percolating around the church. How many of them get to the Pope? I mean, this is not unique to the Defense Department or the U.S. government, or for that matter, for the Congress, right? I mean, the competition for people trying to get something into Senator Markey's desk is enormous, right? And so you and other people there, you're the filters for that. And you have to make informed judgments as to what warrants the senator's attention, what doesn't, and on what time scale. So I think it's a productive relationship. It's at times incestuous in Washington. We all know that, right? We're not naive. But I think it can serve good purposes, that cross-fertilization that Sean Casey talked about.
Just add to that type of in and outer relationship, that cross-fertilization, is very natural in the U.S. government and specifically the U.S. military in a variety of sectors. So people go from civil society, people go from business, people go from academia in and out of these positions, into the military or into government positions, and then back out again. The reason that we all needed to create this special office for religion and global affairs was that cross-fertilization, that insider-outsider, doesn't really work with religious actors. So you had to find some other ways to bring engagement in, with the exception of the chaplains, who are religious actors who work for the U.S. military. There's not that robust set of interactions with those leaders. So the creation of this strategic dialogue with civil society, the working group partnerships with religious actors, culminating in the creation of the Office of Religion and Global Affairs, was a way to change the machinery to create a little bit more regular interaction, while there is a lot more regular interaction and cross-fertilization in some of the other sectors, as Al and you described.
Anna, do you have some suggestions of your own to answer your own question?
I mean, I don't have a good insight into what was happening in the military and intelligence communities. I mean, it did influence what Congress then told the military, and in particular the intelligence community, about looking, doing some work. The NIC did work to look at what environmental and climate and energy in particular issues coming down the pike in the next 30 years would mean for the security issues that confront America and our allies. So, there was some concrete direction from Congress that came out of those early reports. And then, you know, it continues to be a point that I think most members who are already committed to climate policy and action like to make to help bolster their case, because that's generally what they're mostly trying to do, is to gather the strongest argument for their policy proposals. You know, I've had some interesting insight from the social sciences, because, you know, I think there's one thinking that military leaders speaking to a more conservative audience might be able to move them on being concerned about climate change, and some of the social science shows that's actually the opposite, that it forces, they have a sort of negative reaction to it. And, you know, it's a similar question that I think people were wondering about the Pope's encyclical. How would that move audiences that are sometimes more conservative and not concerned about climate change? And I think I'm happy to see that it has had an impact on some of the public that was not as engaged on climate change, and maybe more conservative in some of their other policy concerns, you know, has raised the issue of climate change with them. So hopefully we can build on that.
Other questions? Yes.
Hi, my name is Preston Land. I'm an environmental historian in the graduate department here at Georgetown in the history department. I've also been a officer in the Marine Corps for going on a decade, and this is questions for the panel as a whole. Me being a boot on the ground, I'm interested to know if any of you think there's any potential moral, economic, or environmental problems with the DoD becoming the go-to agency or a new panacea for the U.S. government in regards to issues created by environmental degradation and climate change, such as dealing with climate refugees or internecine warfare in certain areas of the world that the United States, for various reasons, gets involved in. Thank you.
If you read the Congressional Research Service puts out a report every couple of years on the whole long list of U.S. military interventions from the 1700s to the present. And what always strikes me in reading that, as I do every semester with my students, is that from the very beginning of the United States, military forces were used for what we would today call operations other than war, major contingency operations, humanitarian interventions, refugee assistance. You know, the forces were always used for those. And the times in which the forces were used for, quote, kind of conventional international wars are very rare, which is one of the reasons you have only 5 declared wars and hundreds of U.S. military interventions. So that's the descriptive. The problem's been with us a long time. The prescriptive: should DoD be the go-to agency for a whole host of issues that may be veering away from the traditional missions, or at least the missions as they were seen during the Cold War as traditional missions? I think that this is a problem that you have, a challenge you have in self-government. When you're the biggest actor around, okay, and the U.S. military is, with huge resources, huge budgets, and great capability, you're going to get asked to do a lot of things. Would it be better to empower our civilian units of U.S. foreign policy? You bet. Would it make much more sense for civilians in the Department of Defense and USAID to be doing these operations? Absolutely. Is there any chance of getting that through Congress? To budget tick up, you know, those civilian agencies or change resources from DoD to state or others? Not a chance. So unfortunately, the iron triangles and the ways we do defense procurement, authorization, and appropriation means that that problem is a structural one that's going to be with us for some time. But on the other hand, I salute and am always just bowled over by the positive energy and imagination and creativity of boots on the ground, of folks who are given a practical problem, whether or not it should be their issue to address. And the way the can-do attitude will come across with a way to address it. But I do think we need to do better with education, engagement with civil society, so that when military folks are given jobs that really are more appropriate to civilian, they'll at least have the tools, they'll have the ability to reach out to others, to be able to do that job well and not just be stuck up a creek without a paddle on it.
If the Defense Department is to be the go-to agency for environmental cleanup, we're in trouble, okay? That's not what it's set up to do. Does it do some of that work? Yes, it does. But it will never be and should never be the Environmental Protection Agency. Something that Mary Ann alluded to or touched on is, gets back to something I said, which DOD and the military, and Russ knows this better than I do, is eminently practical and pragmatic, and they're very task-oriented. So in Afghanistan and Iraq, we had soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, Coast Guardsmen, who were doing things they weren't trained to do, but there was nobody there else to do them, and they needed to be done, right? I know a retired officer who was a very senior person visited Afghanistan and was sent out, and there was some young sergeant who was in some village, and he was essentially functioning as the town manager of this village. And he did a wonderful job and a wonderful presentation, and the general said to him, well, yeah, man, what do you know about being a town manager? And he said, sir, not much, but I know more than they do. And so he was going to take on this task. I always saluted Bob Gates when he was Secretary of Defense because he gave repeated speeches calling for increased funding for the State Department and AID. We've got to get that balance right. But if DOD is to become the go-to agency for environmental cleanup, we're in trouble because it will always be ancillary. The DOD will do environmental things that are related to its core missions and functions, okay? But it's not going to be the Environmental Protection Agency, nor should it be.
Yeah. So I would offer up the thought. I've been in your boots, and I have that perspective. But a lot of these problems in these countries are just not single-dimensional. It's multidimensional, and the American military is constantly dealing with multidimensional problems. Just their own logistics to be able to survive and understand their environment is a multidimensional effort. So for me, it's not a bad choice. It might not be the exactly right choice. You're always looking to maybe augment the military with the subject matter experts that are going to push things over the top or direct it that way. But the organization of the military is a learning organization. And that's how we breed our people inside it. And so, to me, I think that's one of the big benefits that we do bring to the table is to both learn, adapt, and then be able to kind of provide that multifunctional capability with maybe some outside help to be able to do that. And I've done that before, where we brought in experts from the outside to help us with whether it was EOD, ordnance people that were specialized and things like that.
I think we have time for one more question. Okay.
Hi, I'm Irini Pita. I'm a graduate student in emergency and disaster management at Georgetown School of Continuing Studies. And my question was about risk communication. Do you think that DoD, other governmental agencies, or non-governmental agencies and organizations have been effective in communicating the risk of climate change, or how climate change and environmental issues can pose a threat to national security? Because it seems to me that if this risk is effectively communicated, then that would induce a change in behavior or policies. So my question is on risk communication.
I think the Defense Department has come to do a pretty good job of communicating the implications of environmental change for the things that the Defense Department does. But it's not the early warning system for environmental risk across the board. I think as Marianne sketched out, and I tried to sketch out a little bit, over the last, 5, 10, 15 years, DoD has become better at understanding the implications of climate change and other environmental factors for the things DoD does. But it's not going to look at the effect of environmental change on our education system or this, that, or the other thing. So in its own zone, I think it is getting better at it, actually getting pretty good at that. But as for communicating the risk more broadly, it's not the Public Health Service, and it's not the Environmental Protection Agency.
And I'd say communicating to whom? So communicating internally, yes. Communicating to the U.S. Congress and other government agencies, yes. Communicating when there's a specific practical issue to be addressed to host countries, yes. But communicating to the U.S. public in a wider way, that's, as Al said, that's not their job. And also if you look at in what ways would that percolate out to wider norms, to what degree have these types of courses made it their way into the curriculum offered at U.S. military academies, U.S. military educational institutions? There's not many standalone courses on this. It percolates into courses on, current threat environments, the needing to be multifunctional, multivariate in the threat environment. But there's not a way in which this is communicated separately, I would say.
One quick comment just on what Marianne said. I actually think, and I've spent 30 years in professional military education, I think what you said is really critical. It's to weave these non-traditional considerations into the traditional business of what the military does. If it's treated as a separate entity apart from it, it will always be a separate entity and ancillary and incidental. So the challenge, I think, is to weave these issues into the core functions, the core curriculum of professional military education at a variety of levels. If it's seen as something separate, it'll always be optional, it'll always be elective, but it really needs to be woven into the fabric of our broader understanding of security.
Join me now in thanking our presenters.